Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I stood in my kitchen, letting the cool night air seep in through the half-open window. The house was quiet, but the silence pressed in on me like a weight. It wasn't just the quiet after being away for so long. It was something else, something wrong. The fridge hummed, the floor creaked under my boots, but it didn't feel like home. I ran my fingers over the edge of the countertop, feeling the sharpness of the granite beneath my skin, grounding myself in the physical world while my mind buzzed with a growing sense of unease. The first thing I noticed was the photo frame. It used to sit right next to the fruit bowl, a picture of Lindsay and me from our honeymoon. Now it was facing the wrong way, angled awkwardly like someone had shoved it aside in a hurry. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the edge of her face in the picture. She was smiling, the sun catching her blonde hair. But looking at it now, all I saw was distance. Even then, maybe, there'd been something I hadn't seen, something I'd missed. I put the frame back where it belonged and wandered through the house, everything familiar, yet strange. The smell hit me next, a faint, unfamiliar cologne, not mine. I paused in the hallway, staring at the bedroom door. I almost went in, but something held me back. Not yet. The bedroom could wait. I leaned against the door frame, flashes of our last conversations coming back to me. Before I'd left for my last deployment, something had changed. We didn't fight, not exactly. It was more like there was nothing left to fight about, just a cold, silent distance. I figured it was the stress of my leaving again, that we'd pick up where we left off when I came home. But I had been wrong. Now back in this house, the distance between us felt like an ocean I couldn't cross. I headed for the living room where her scent, coconut and vanilla, still clung to the cushions. I dropped onto the couch, trying to shake the tightness in my chest. I'd been trained to deal with tension, to stay calm under pressure. Years in the military had taught me to control my breathing, slow my thoughts. But this was different. This wasn't a firefight or an ambush. This was my life, and it felt like it was slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't even see what I was losing. Lindsay wasn't here. I should have been greeted with a hug, a kiss, something. She hadn't even answered my text after I landed, just a short, clipped message telling me she was out with friends. I wanted to believe it, wanted to push down the doubts gnawing at my mind. But something had shifted, something I couldn't ignore any longer. I thought about my brother Luke, the golden boy, always charming, always there. He'd been helping Lindsay out while I was away, fixing things around the house, making sure she wasn't alone. I'd asked him to keep an eye on her, thinking he'd be the one person I could trust. But Luke had gone quiet recently. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. No updates, no jokes to lighten the load, just silence. I figured he was busy, or maybe, just maybe, there was something else. I pushed the thought aside, shaking my head. Luke wouldn't do anything to hurt me. He couldn't. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my texts. Messages from her felt colder now, rereading them with the weight of suspicion sitting on my chest. Her responses had grown more distant over the months. She'd stopped asking when I'd be home, stopped saying she missed me. I told myself it was stress, loneliness, whatever excuse I could find. But the excuses were running out. It was late when I finally heard the door open. I glanced up from the couch as Lindsay walked in, her eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away. Something flickered across her face. Guilt? I couldn't be sure. I smiled, but it felt hollow. "You're home late," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," she said, shrugging as she tossed her bag onto the table. "Lost track of time." She didn't offer an explanation, didn't say where she'd been. I studied her face, looking for signs, for anything that might confirm the gnawing suspicion eating at me. Her makeup looked fresh, like she'd just reapplied it, but she wasn't wearing the same perfume she used to. It was softer, more expensive, and there it was again, that faint, unfamiliar scent of cologne clinging to her clothes. She moved around the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine without asking if I wanted one. Her back was to me, her shoulders tense. "How was your night?" I asked, forcing casualness into my voice. "Fine," she muttered, taking a sip of her drink. She still didn't turn to face me. I stood up, walking toward her, but when I reached out to put a hand on her shoulder, she flinched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. She moved away before I could even ask if something was wrong. "We need to talk, Lindsay," I said, my voice low, controlled. "What's going on?" She turned to face me, her eyes flicking up briefly before settling on her wine glass. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been distant. You barely looked at me when I walked in the door. I've been gone for months. Now I'm back, and it feels like you're not here." She sighed, rubbing her forehead like she was too tired to deal with this conversation. "It's just a lot, okay? You've been gone a long time, and I've had to deal with everything on my own." "It's not that simple." I wanted to push her, to demand more, but something in her tone made me stop. I couldn't place it. Maybe exhaustion, maybe guilt. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that something between us had broken, and I didn't know if I had the strength to fix it anymore. "I get that it's hard," I said, stepping back. "But we've always been able to talk. I don't want us to lose that." Lindsay nodded but said nothing. She finished her wine and left the room without another word. I stood there staring at the space she just occupied, wondering if I'd imagined it, the distance, the coldness in her voice. But I hadn't. It was real. I made my way to the bedroom, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't rest. She was already in bed, her back to me. The room was dark, but I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't just walked into our home like a stranger. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, the soft glow of the streetlights filtering in through the curtains. Sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept spinning, turning over every interaction, every missed call, every distant text. There were small cracks in our life, cracks that had been widening while I was gone, and I'd been too blind to see them. Luke's face flashed in my mind, his crooked grin, the way he could charm anyone. He'd always been the life of the party, always drawing attention, and Lindsay had always liked that about him. They'd been close, maybe too close. No. I shut down that thought as soon as it surfaced. Luke was my brother. He wouldn't do something like that. Not to me. But then why had he gone silent? Why hadn't he responded to my texts in weeks? The questions swirled, filling the space in my mind with doubts I didn't want to acknowledge. I wasn't the paranoid type, but this was different. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, heavier, as if they were pressing in on me, suffocating me with uncertainty. I felt a tightness in my chest, a weight I couldn't shake. Something had changed in the time I'd been away, something I couldn't yet see, but I could feel it, lurking just beyond my reach. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. The sense of wrongness grew like a shadow creeping over everything I thought I knew. The photo frame, the cologne, the way she'd flinched. It all pointed to something I wasn't ready to face, but I knew, deep down, that I couldn't ignore it much longer. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I lay there listening to the soft sound of Lindsay's breathing, wondering how everything had come to this, how the life I'd known, the woman I'd loved, had slipped away while I wasn't looking. Tomorrow, I'd confront it. Whatever it was that had changed, whatever it was I couldn't yet see, I'd find it. And then, I'd decide what to do. But tonight, all I could do was wait, trapped in the darkness, knowing that whatever was hiding in the shadows would come into the light soon enough. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, as I always had during deployment, but this time, it felt different. The heaviness from the night before lingered, thick in the air, an invisible tension pressing down on my chest. The bed was cold next to me. Lindsay had already gotten up. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that something was crawling under my skin. I dragged myself out of bed, went through the motions, shower, shave, a cup of black coffee in silence. The house was empty except for the sound of the coffee machine hissing in the corner. Lindsay was always up early, but lately, I hadn't been able to keep track of her comings and goings. When I'd ask her about her plans, She'd brush it off with vague answers, a late work meeting, a night out with friends. Her answers were always slippery, like she didn't want me to get too close to the truth. I glanced at her phone on the counter, face down, a habit she'd picked up in the last few months. We never used to have secrets. I knew her passcode, she knew mine. But now, even her phone seemed like a weapon, a ticking time bomb that could go off at any moment. I stared at it for a second longer than I should have, my mind spinning with the idea of just flipping it over, unlocking it, finding out what was really going on. But I didn't. Not yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being paranoid, jumping to conclusions without evidence. Luke hadn't returned my messages, but he'd always been flaky like that. And Lindsay, maybe she was just struggling with the same distance I'd felt after being away. War changes you. It puts a gap between you and the people you left behind. Maybe I was just looking for answers where there were none. Still, the nagging doubt was there, growing, creeping in like rot under the surface. I spent the rest of the day pretending things were normal. Lindsay came home around noon, but something was off in the way she moved, the way she barely acknowledged me. We ate lunch together, barely talking. She picked at her salad while I stared at her, trying to read the lines on her face, the subtle shifts in her expression. But she kept her gaze on her plate, avoiding eye contact, avoiding me. "Busy day?" I asked, trying to sound casual, trying not to let the suspicion seep into my voice. She nodded, her fork scraping against the plate. "Yeah, just work stuff." The same vague answer she always gave. I hated the way she said it, like it was the most normal thing in the world, like we hadn't become strangers living under the same roof. "What about you?" she asked, not really caring. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, like her mind was somewhere else. I shrugged. "Same. Just trying to get back into a routine." She nodded again, still not looking at me. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "I was thinking," I said, breaking the silence, "we could go out tonight, just the two of us. Maybe catch a movie, get some dinner." Lindsay hesitated, and for a split second, I saw it. A flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt? Panic? It was gone before I could be sure. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I can't tonight," she said, standing up and taking her plate to the sink. "I already made plans with Jenna." "Jenna," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've been seeing her a lot lately." She turned, leaning against the counter, crossing her arms. "Yeah, well, it's been nice to have a friend while you've been gone." "What's wrong with that?" The defensive tone in her voice was like a slap to the face. I stood up, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Nothing's wrong with it, Lindsay. It's just, we haven't really spent any time together since I got back." Her expression hardened. "I'm not going to drop everything just because you decided to come home." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. Decided to come home, like it was some casual choice I made, like I hadn't been risking my life overseas while she was here, living comfortably. I bit back the anger rising in my throat. "I didn't just decide, Lindsay. I came home because my deployment ended. You know that." She sighed, turning away from me, her voice softening. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. It's just hard, adjusting. For both of us." I wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that maybe this was all just an adjustment period, that we'd find our way back to each other. But the way she said it, the way she avoided looking at me, it felt like a lie. Like she was trying to placate me, keep me from asking too many questions. She left shortly after, claiming she had to meet Jenna for drinks. I watched her walk out the door, her movements stiff, like she couldn't wait to get away from me. As the door clicked shut, the tension that had been building inside me finally snapped. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Something was wrong, terribly, undeniably wrong. I grabbed my phone and texted Luke again. No response. The silence was deafening. I scrolled back through our old conversations, reading the easy banter we used to have, the casual check-ins. Everything had changed in the past few weeks. He'd stopped texting, stopped calling, just like Lindsay had stopped caring. The two people I trusted most in the world were slipping away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. I sat there for hours, the house empty and quiet around me, my mind racing through every interaction, every missed message, Every time Lindsay had come home late or avoided my questions. It was late when I heard the sound, the muffled laughter coming from upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I shouldn't have heard anything. I was supposed to be alone. I stood, my hands clenched into fists, listening. The laughter came again, soft but unmistakable. A woman's laugh, Lindsay's laugh. My stomach dropped. I started up the stairs, my heart racing, my hands shaking. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what I was about to discover pressing down on me. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again, her voice, mixed with another voice, a man's voice. I stopped outside the bedroom door, my hand hovering over the knob. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my chest tight with a combination of dread and fury. I knew that voice, Luke. My hand trembled as I twisted the doorknob, pushing the door open slowly, the hinges creaking like a scream in the silence. The room came into view, and there they were, tangled in the sheets, Lindsay and Luke, my brother, in my bed. They froze when they saw me, their faces going pale. Lindsay gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Luke, he just smiled. That same cocky, smug grin he'd always had, the one that made people love him, made people forgive him for every mistake, every betrayal. "You should be thankful," Luke said, his voice casual, like this was some kind of joke. "I was just looking out for her while you were gone." Something inside me snapped. The world tilted, everything shifting out of focus. My vision blurred, my blood roaring in my ears. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I stood there staring at them, my body frozen, but my mind spinning, racing through every possible response. Scream, punch him, throw something, make them hurt the way I was hurting. But I didn't do any of those things. I didn't react at all. I turned and walked out of the room, my footsteps heavy, deliberate. I went downstairs, back to the kitchen, back to the place where everything had felt wrong the moment I'd walked in. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands trembling, my mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 emotions. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. They all swirled together in a chaotic storm, but I forced myself to be still, forced myself to breathe, to think. I stared at the wall, the empty space in front of me, trying to process what I'd just seen, my brother, my wife. The two people I had trusted more than anyone, the people I had thought would be there for me no matter what. They had been betraying me, lying to me, while I was out risking my life for them. My hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white. The rage simmered beneath the surface, but I held it back. I wouldn't lose control. Not now. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. Lindsay and Luke thought they had me figured out. They thought they could get away with it, thought I would just take it, just be the same old me. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't the same man who had left for deployment, and I wasn't going to let this slide. I would make them pay, both of them. But first, I had to plan. I had to think. I didn't go back upstairs that night. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen, sitting at the table, staring blankly ahead. My mind was a battlefield. I thought I knew what war was. Dust storms, bullets whizzing past your head, the stench of sweat and fear. But this betrayal was something else entirely. It gnawed at me, clawing at my insides, making me feel smaller with each passing second. I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. Luke's smug grin, the way he lounged in my bed like it was his, the way Lindsay gasped, eyes wide like she was caught shoplifting. Luke wasn't even sorry. He just sat there casually telling me I should be thankful. Thankful. The word echoed in my skull like a bad joke, mocking me. I clenched my fists so hard I could feel my nails biting into my palms, the pain grounding me. They thought they had me pegged, a fool, a soft-hearted soldier who'd been too blind to see what was happening right under his nose. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Not anymore. I'd seen too much, done too much to let this slide. And I wasn't about to confront them with some pathetic demand for answers. No, I'd make them pay in ways they wouldn't see coming. When the sun came up, I had a plan. It wasn't fully formed, not yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to play the victim. I wasn't going to lose my head, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them win. The first step was simple. Wait. Watch. I needed to see how deep this betrayal went, and more importantly, how they operated together. Luke, I could predict. He'd always been reckless, never thinking past the next thrill. But Lindsay? She was smarter. Cunning even. She'd be the harder one to break. But I knew where to hit her financials. She'd never had to struggle, not with me footing the bills, giving her the security she craved. And Luke? Well, Luke had a perfect life, a rising career. That would change. I didn't say a word to either of them when they came downstairs later that morning. I acted like nothing had happened. Lindsay glanced at me nervously, her eyes flitting to the ground as if waiting for an explosion. Luke, on the other hand, strolled down like he owned the place, that arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Morning, bro," he said, as if we were still playing the part of siblings who trusted each other. I ignored him, sipping my coffee. The silence between us stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Lindsay busied herself at the counter, but I caught the way her hands shook slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. She was cracking, and I didn't even need to say a word. Luke's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at me. "I've got some stuff to take care of today." "Work things." His voice was casual, but there was a challenge in his eyes, like he was daring me to call him out, to bring up what had happened last night. I didn't. Instead, I nodded slowly, letting the tension linger. I wanted him to sweat a little, to wonder what I was thinking, what I was planning. "Yeah, sure," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Go take care of your work." He paused for a second, like he wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more suspicious, but then he gave me a lazy salute and headed out. I watched him go, my mind already working through how I would destroy him. Lindsay stayed quiet, sitting across from me at the table, her eyes fixed on her phone. She didn't look at me once. When she finally left to meet her so-called friend Jenna, I got to work. I needed to know how long this affair had been going on. I needed to know the details, and I needed to know what I was up against. The first step was easy, her phone. She had a habit of leaving it lying around when she thought I wasn't paying attention. She'd gotten sloppy. I picked it up, unlocked it with the same passcode she'd had for years. Within minutes, I found what I was looking for. Messages, dozens of them, between her and Luke. I scrolled through the texts, my stomach twisting. They were detailed, explicit. It had been going on for months. They'd even planned trips together, weekends where I'd thought she was visiting her family or out of town for work. My brother, my wife, playing house while I was halfway around the world. The rage that burned inside me felt like acid, but I pushed it down, forcing myself to breathe through the anger. I couldn't let it consume me, not yet. There was still work to be done. I grabbed my laptop, started looking into Luke's finances, his job. He worked at a mid-sized financial firm, nothing too fancy, but he was climbing the ladder fast. His boss liked him, and from what I could tell, Luke had built himself a solid reputation. It was a shame, really. He'd worked so hard to get where he was, and it would take just a few carefully placed emails, a few false accusations, to tear it all down. I knew how to cover my tracks. The military had taught me more than just how to fight. It taught me how to think like the enemy, how to anticipate their moves, how to strike before they even realized they were under attack. It started small. A fake email from Luke's account sent to his boss, subtly hinting at some insider trading. Nothing too obvious, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. I knew the firm he worked for took compliance very seriously. It wouldn't take much for them to start an investigation, and once they did, Luke's entire career would be on the line. While that was simmering, I turned my attention to Lindsay. She thought she was smart, hiding money in separate accounts she probably thought I didn't know about. But I knew everything. Every cent she'd squirreled away, every little fund she'd set up in her name. It was all linked, and it only took a few clicks for me to drain the accounts. She wouldn't notice it right away, not yet. But when she did, she'd be scrambling, and there'd be nothing she could do about it. I sat back, feeling the first flicker of satisfaction in days. The pieces were falling into place. The next few days passed in a blur of cold precision. I avoided direct confrontation with them. Luke was still strutting around like nothing was wrong, and Lindsay was keeping her distance, too afraid to ask if I'd figured it out, too guilty to pretend nothing had happened. They were both playing their parts, and I let them. But things started to unravel for Luke faster than he anticipated. A week after I'd sent the email, he came by the house looking rattled. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made me smile inwardly. "I'm being audited," he said, pacing the living room. "Some bullshit about internal investigations at work. They think I've been involved in something shady." I nodded, hiding the satisfaction bubbling up inside me. "That's rough, man. Any idea how it started?" He shook his head, running his hands through his hair. "No clue. I've been careful. They said something about a flagged transaction from my account, but I haven't done anything wrong." Liar. I wanted to laugh at his desperation, the way he was already trying to dig himself out of the hole I'd put him in. But I kept my face neutral, nodding like I sympathized with his situation. "Maybe it's just a mistake," I said, keeping my voice level. "You know how these things go. Probably nothing." Luke didn't seem convinced, but he nodded anyway, pacing a few more steps before finally leaving. He was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before his entire world fell apart. Lindsay, on the other hand, was more cautious. She hadn't mentioned anything about the missing money yet, but I could see the tension building in her. She'd been on her phone more than usual, making hushed calls in the other room, probably trying to figure out where her safety net had gone. I waited, knowing it was only a matter of time before she confronted me. It happened 2 days later. She came home from work, her face pale, her eyes wide with barely concealed panic. I was sitting at the kitchen table as I had been the first night I discovered their betrayal, sipping my coffee, waiting for her to crack. "I can't access my accounts," she said, her voice trembling. "The money's gone." "All of it." I looked up, feigning surprise. "Gone? What do you mean?" She glared at me, her composure crumbling. "Don't play dumb with me. You know what I'm talking about. What did you do?" I stood up, taking a slow step toward her. "What did I do?" "Lindsay, you've been lying to me for months. You and Luke, in my bed. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. She'd made her choices. She'd betrayed me. There was no coming back from that. "We can work through this," she said, her voice breaking. "We can go to counseling." "Fix it." I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "Fix it? There's nothing left to fix. You destroyed everything. Now, it's time to face the consequences." Lindsay stared at me, her expression shifting from desperation to realization. She knew that I wasn't going to play her game. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness. I turned away from her, heading for the door. "You should have thought of that before." She didn't follow me. She couldn't. I was already gone, leaving her to pick up the pieces of the life she'd shattered. Now, it was time for Luke. The night of the event had finally arrived. Luke and Lindsay were dressed to the nines, all smiles as they prepped for the big family gathering, a charity gala that Luke's company sponsored every year. He was always the star at these things, basking in the attention, the admiration. Our parents would be there too, fawning over him like they always did, the golden boy who could do no wrong. This year would be different. I watched them from the doorway as they moved around the house, getting ready. Luke, ever the cocky bastard, made a few jokes about how I should loosen up and join them. Lindsay barely glanced my way, though I could see the tension in her movements, the way she avoided eye contact. She was nervous. She knew something was off. She just didn't know how bad it was going to get. I let them leave without a word, watching from the window as Luke's BMW pulled out of the driveway, Lindsay sitting in the passenger seat, adjusting her dress. The anger that had been simmering inside me was now an icy, calculated focus. Tonight, everything would come crashing down for both of them. They wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. Once they were gone, I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The air was crisp, biting, but it felt good against my skin. Grounding. The drive to the gala wasn't long, but every second was filled with anticipation, my heart beating in sync with the rhythm of my plan. I parked a few blocks away, far enough to stay out of sight but close enough to get there when I needed to. I'd be watching it all unfold from a safe distance, like a general overseeing a battlefield. My soldiers, carefully laid traps, were already in position. Luke's boss would be arriving soon, just like I'd arranged. I had planted the perfect storm of false evidence, a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to Luke. Emails, financial records, a whisper here, a rumor there. It was all too easy to make it look like he'd been skimming off the top, padding his own accounts. I knew his company's internal policies. They'd have to investigate, and when they found the fabricated evidence, there'd be no escape for Luke. His perfect reputation would be shattered in front of everyone who mattered to him. It wouldn't be enough to destroy him quietly. I wanted the world to see the fall. For Lindsay, it was something more personal. She thought she was still in control, that she could walk away from me and land on her feet with the money she'd hidden. But that safety net was gone. I drained every account she had without her knowing, rerouted the funds into places she'd never find. And tonight, right in the middle of the event, she'd get a notification from her bank, her balance reduced to nothing. The panic would hit her like a tidal wave. The beautiful life she tried to build with Luke would crumble into dust. I pulled out my phone, checking the time. The gala would be in full swing now. Luke would be mingling, shaking hands, unaware of what was about to happen. I imagined the moment his boss approached him, the confusion on Luke's face as the accusations were laid out, the slow realization dawning that this wasn't a mistake, that someone had set him up. I smiled, the anticipation a heady rush. Then came the text message. Just 3 words from the contact I'd planted inside Luke's office. It's done. I leaned back in my seat, feeling a cold satisfaction settle into my bones. Luke's downfall had begun. The humiliation would be swift and public. His golden boy reputation, the one he'd lorded over me all these years, would be torn to pieces in front of everyone. There would be no coming back from this. I imagined his face, shocked, desperate, scrambling for explanations, but there wouldn't be any that could save him. The evidence was airtight, and he wouldn't have time to defend himself, not with the authorities already involved. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lindsay. Her message was short, panicked. What the hell is happening? I could picture her now, her face draining of color as she checked her bank accounts, seeing every cent she thought she'd hidden wiped away. The fear, the realization that she was completely, utterly trapped. She'd depended on that money to start a new life without me, to run away with Luke once the dust settled. Now she had nothing, no backup plan, no exit strategy. I didn't respond. I just sat there staring at the screen, savoring the moment. I could see it all so clearly. Inside the gala, Luke's boss would be pulling him aside, whispering about the audit, the discrepancies in the financials. Then, the handcuffs. The police arriving, not even giving him the dignity of a quiet conversation. No, they'd arrest him right there, in front of everyone, make him a spectacle. That was the beauty of it. It wasn't just about the crime. It was about the shame. About tearing down the man who'd always stood so high above me. I gave it a few more minutes, watching the time tick by, imagining the chaos unfolding inside. Then, I made my move. I stepped out of the car, slipping into the shadows, making my way toward the entrance of the grand ballroom. I wouldn't go in. There was no need for that. I just wanted to be close enough to feel the tension in the air, to hear the murmurs of shock and confusion as Luke's world fell apart. I could see people gathered outside the venue, whispering in small groups, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Something was happening inside, something big. I could feel the energy of it, the ripple of gossip spreading like wildfire. I hung back in the shadows, just far enough to stay unseen but close enough to catch snippets of conversation. Can you believe it? Luke? I never would have thought. I heard they found discrepancies in the company's accounts. Arrested. Right in front of everyone. I smiled, the satisfaction growing with each word. It was working. Everything I'd set in motion was playing out exactly as I'd planned. I didn't need to see Luke's face to know what it looked like. I could imagine the panic, the desperation, the disbelief. He'd be trying to argue, trying to talk his way out of it, but it wouldn't matter. The evidence was damning. His perfect life was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As for Lindsay, I knew she'd be standing in the middle of the chaos, her phone clutched in her hand, the realization sinking in that everything was gone. Her money, her security, her escape plan, it was all dust. She thought she could betray me, destroy our life, and walk away unscathed. But now, she was as trapped as Luke. I stood there for a while longer, listening to the whispers, feeling the satisfaction wash over me. Then, when I was sure the damage was done, I turned and walked away. I didn't need to see the aftermath. I already knew how it ended. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt an eerie sense of calm settle over me. The storm that had been brewing inside me for weeks was finally over. Luke and Lindsay had destroyed everything I thought I'd had, everything I thought I was, but I'd taken control back. I'd made them pay. But as I drove, that sense of calm began to give way to something else, something emptier, the satisfaction I'd thought I'd feel. It was there, but it was hollow. I'd won, but at what cost? The truth hit me in the quiet of the night. The anger that had consumed me was gone, but it had taken something with it. The man I'd been before, the soldier, the husband, the brother, he was gone too. All that was left was the aftermath of what I'd done, and the realization that maybe, just maybe, I'd destroyed more than just Luke and Lindsay. I'd destroyed myself. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty, the city lights fading behind me as I drove into the unknown. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No alarms, no texts, no questions, just an empty, quiet house. It was over. Luke was behind bars. It had taken less than 24 hours for the investigation to wrap him up in a neat little bow. His boss didn't wait to act. He'd been fired immediately, disgraced in front of everyone at the gala. The cops had hauled him out like a common criminal, his face a mask of confusion and desperation. He probably still didn't understand how it had all gone so wrong, how his perfect life had collapsed in an instant. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel triumph either. It was done, but the victory tasted like ash. Lindsay, though, was a different story. She hadn't gone to the police. She hadn't fought back. She didn't have the strength for that anymore. I imagined her sitting alone in some corner of the house we once shared, scrolling through her phone, checking her drained bank accounts over and over, as if the numbers would magically reappear. She'd called, of course, dozens of times. She left voicemails that ranged from furious to pleading. Her texts were full of half apologies, laced with desperation and confusion. I hadn't responded. I didn't need to. Lindsay had built her life on the false promise that she could betray me and come out unscathed. Now, she was just another casualty of her own greed. The first few hours after I'd left the gala, I couldn't get enough of the silence. I thought that was the peace I was after, the stillness, the absence of their voices in my head. The house felt bigger, colder, a clean slate for me to build whatever came next. But the more I moved through the day, the more I realized that silence wasn't peace, it was emptiness. I had destroyed them, yes, but what had I built in its place? I picked up my phone, scrolling through the voicemails. Lindsay's voice played out, broken, almost unrecognizable. "I'm sorry. I don't know how this happened. We can fix this. I know we can." She paused, her breath catching like she was trying to hold back tears. "Please talk to me. We can't just throw everything away." I deleted the message without a second thought. There was no fixing this, and she knew it. She'd thrown everything away the moment she crawled into bed with Luke. That was the point of no return. By noon, Luke's arrest was all over the news. Financial fraud, embezzlement. They slapped every charge they could on him. It didn't matter that most of it wasn't real. Perception was everything, and Luke's reputation was permanently shattered. His mugshot was plastered across every local news outlet, his wide-eyed panic frozen in that moment of complete downfall. I watched it for a while, the reporters scrambling to put together the story, trying to make sense of the scandal. The phone rang again. Lindsay. This time I picked up. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, like she hadn't expected me to answer. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then her voice broke through, raw and desperate. "Please, can we just talk?" I stayed quiet, letting her hang on the edge. "I don't have anyone else," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't, I didn't think it would end up like this. I could hear her unraveling. Her control was gone, just like the money. And now, she wanted me to be the one to fix it, to hold her hand through the wreckage she'd caused. But I wasn't that man anymore. I didn't need to be. You made your choice, Lindsay. The words came out cold, detached, as if someone else had spoken them. I know, I did, she stammered. But please, I hung up, not wanting to hear the rest. There was no point. She could beg all she wanted, but I wasn't her lifeline anymore. That part of me, the man who would have done anything to save her, to protect her, he was long gone. I sat there in the quiet of the house, staring at the phone, waiting for the rush of satisfaction to come. But it never did. All I felt was a strange hollowness, like I'd been stripped down to something I didn't recognize. Revenge had given me control, sure, but it had taken more than I realized. I walked through the house, each room a reminder of what had been lost. The kitchen where Lindsay and I used to laugh over dinner, the living room where we'd spent countless nights curled up together, pretending the world outside didn't matter. Now every corner felt like a graveyard for the life we'd shared, a life that no longer belonged to either of us. The front door creaked open and I stepped outside, the air cold against my skin. I looked down the street at the quiet, peaceful neighborhood I'd come to think of as home. But this place wasn't home anymore, not for me. I knew what had to come next. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't live in the ruins of what I'd destroyed. The anger that had driven me was gone, and in its place was something far worse. Emptiness, the absence of purpose. Back inside, I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began throwing in clothes, the bare essentials. There wasn't much I needed. Everything that mattered was already behind me. The house, the memories, the betrayals. They were ghosts now, things I couldn't carry with me any longer. I packed lightly, the sound of zippers and fabric the only noise in the house. I passed by the hallway mirror on the way out. For a moment I paused, staring at the reflection. The man looking back at me was a stranger. His eyes were colder, harder than I remembered. The lines around his face were deeper, the weight of everything that had happened etched into his skin. This wasn't who I'd been before. This was what revenge had made me. I slung the bag over my shoulder and headed for the door. There was no point in saying goodbye. No one would be here to hear it. The house stood quiet, empty, like a hollow shell, just like me. As I drove away, I didn't look back. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty roads. The further I drove, the lighter I felt, as if each mile was stripping away another layer of the man I used to be. I had no destination in mind. I didn't need one. Anywhere was better than where I'd come from. The road stretched out ahead of me, dark and endless, the silence of the car broken only by the hum of the engine. I kept driving, feeling the distance between me and the life I'd left behind grow wider with each passing minute. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. There was no plan, no strategy, no calculated next step, just the road ahead and the unknown. Maybe, somewhere out there, I'd find peace, or maybe I wouldn't. But at least now, I was free. Free from the lies, the betrayals, and the ghosts of what used to be. I checked the rearview mirror one last time, the house and the city already fading into the distance, swallowed by the darkness behind me. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a faint flicker of hope, like a spark in the cold, a new beginning. Whatever came next, it couldn't be worse than what I'd left behind. And for now, that was enough. I pressed my foot on the gas and the road opened up before me, long and empty, full of possibilities. I didn't know who I'd become, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't that man anymore. It's been months since I left, since I threw my bags in the back of the car and drove without looking back. The road stretched on endlessly, taking me through small towns and cities I'd never thought to visit. Motels, gas stations, and rest stops became my temporary homes, places where I could disappear for a while. No ties, no questions, just the rhythm of the road, a nameless face in the background. Each morning I'd wake up, drive another few hundred miles, and repeat the process. I thought the distance would help me breathe again, let the weight of everything I'd done fall away. It didn't. There was always a darkness hanging just behind my eyes, waiting for me in the quiet. No matter how far I went, I couldn't outrun it. At night, when the world slowed down, I felt it creeping back in. The echoes of Lindsay's voice, Luke's smirk, the sound of my own heart breaking all over again. I thought the satisfaction would come, that sweet feeling of triumph, of justice served. But the satisfaction was as hollow as the life I'd left behind. It never filled me the way I thought it would. Instead, it left me with a cold, gnawing emptiness, a void that grew larger the longer I stayed away. I don't know when the nightmares started, but they come often now. I see Luke, his hands in cuffs, staring at me with pleading eyes, but I say nothing. I see Lindsay, crumpled, shattered, begging for help. They're trapped in the destruction I created, and in some twisted way, I'm trapped there with them. Maybe this was the cost of revenge. Maybe this was what I deserved. Some nights I lie awake staring at the ceiling, trying to remember who I used to be. The soldier who went off to war. The man who loved his wife, who trusted his brother. I try to picture that man, the one I was before all this. But his face is blurry now, a distant memory fading into smoke. I don't recognize him anymore. I look in the mirror and the person staring back isn't the same man who once believed in loyalty, in love, in family. His eyes are colder, harder, and filled with something I can't quite name. The military taught me to survive, to push through pain, to stay in control no matter what. But it didn't prepare me for this. It didn't prepare me for the toll that revenge would take on my soul. I thought I was getting justice. What I got instead was a long, slow destruction. I have no one now. No friends, no family, no connections. I made sure of that. I didn't just burn bridges, I set the whole town on fire. And now, standing in the ashes, I'm alone. But there's something else too. As the months passed, I began to feel something else stir beneath the emptiness. At first, I didn't recognize it. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, like a quiet voice I hadn't heard in years. Hope. It wasn't loud, wasn't demanding. It was just there. A small flicker in the darkness, growing a little stronger each day. Maybe it was because I had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was because I'd finally faced the worst parts of myself, seen the depths of what I was capable of, and survived it. Whatever the reason, the idea of a new beginning didn't seem as impossible as it once had. I hadn't thought about the future in a long time. I didn't know what a future without the weight of betrayal looked like. But now, as I drove through the quiet highways, past endless fields and rolling hills, I felt something inside me shift. I wasn't that man anymore, the man who had been betrayed, the man who'd lost everything. He didn't exist. Not really. I was someone else now. Someone harder, yes. Someone colder. But maybe, just maybe, someone who could rebuild. I didn't know where I was going. The destination didn't matter. What mattered was that I was moving, putting distance between myself and the past. The further I went, the lighter the burden felt. Each mile was like peeling back a layer of skin, revealing something new underneath. Something raw, but alive. I'd been driving for hours when I finally pulled over at a rest stop just before sunset. The air was crisp, clean, the sky painted in shades of orange and red. I stepped out of the car and leaned against the hood, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the pull of anger or regret. I didn't feel the weight of what I'd done pressing down on my chest. I just felt still. I thought about everything that had happened, about Lindsay and Luke, about how their betrayal had gutted me, twisted me into something I barely recognized. But I also thought about how, in a strange way, it had freed me. Without them, without the lies and the pretense, I was finally able to see myself clearly. I wasn't the man I used to be. I wasn't a husband or a brother or even a soldier anymore. I was something else, something undefined. And maybe that was okay. Maybe not knowing who I was supposed to be was the first step toward figuring it out. I pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up with old notifications, missed calls, and texts from numbers I didn't care about anymore. I scrolled through the messages, my finger hovering over one from Lindsay that I'd saved, unread, from weeks ago. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. She'd been trying to reach me to make amends, to apologize, but there was nothing left to say, nothing I wanted to hear. Without hesitation, I deleted the message. Then I went through and deleted the rest, every voicemail, every text. It was time to cut the last remaining threads of that old life. I didn't need them hanging over me anymore. I watched as the messages disappeared, one by one, until there was nothing left. The screen went black and I felt lighter, like I could finally move forward. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. In front of me, the road stretched on, endless and open, with nothing but possibilities ahead. I didn't know where it led, but for the first time, that didn't scare me. I got back in the car, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. The darkness closed in around me, but I didn't feel lost. I felt free. The past was behind me now, fading into the distance like a bad dream. The man I used to be, the man who had been betrayed, who had sought revenge, he was gone. And in his place, there was someone new, someone unburdened by the weight of it all. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know who I would become. But as the road stretched out before me, endless and full of potential, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Maybe it wasn't complete yet. Maybe it was just the beginning of something bigger. But for now, that was enough. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was mine. No more looking back. No more ghosts from the past. Just me. Just the road. And for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that. I pressed my foot on the gas, the horizon stretching out before me, wide and full of promise. The sun was gone, but I didn't need its light to see the path ahead. I was finally free.